we will be touching upon John 12, verse 12 to 19, and we are looking at the event which is commonly known as Palm Sunday. As we study the triumphal entry of Jesus to Jerusalem, we need to look at a few facts regarding this event. All right, let's look at a few facts regarding this event. Number one, this event is recorded in all the four Gospels: Matthew 21, verse 4 to 9, Mark 11, verse 7 to 10, Luke 19, verse 35 to 38, and John 12, verse 12 to 15. Now, the next thing we need to know is that John places Jesus' triumphal entry after the dinner at Bethany in a chronological manner. And this is seen in verse 12 of this chapter. The next day, as in the day after the dinner that happened at Bethany, this happened. Whereas Matthew and Mark place the triumphal entry before they record the dinner at Bethany. They write their accounts in a topical way, as they deal with each topic to make the readers see the connection between the dinner episode and the crucifixion episode. Number 3, as you see in verse 12, this triumphal entry happens 5 days before the Passover. That is a day after the dinner at Bethany. Chapter 12 and verse 1 tells us 6 days before the Passover. So that means chapter 12, verse 12 should be 5 days before the Passover. The next fact is that this triumphal entry happened in the vicinity of Mount Olives near to Bethany. And that is seen in Luke 19, verse 37. And number 5, the disciples who heard Jesus' words in this place didn't make sense of what he said here, just like you see in John 2, verse 21 and 22. But they eventually will understand everything written about Jesus when Jesus will be glorified after his death and resurrection. Now, let's explain this passage. Let's read verse 12. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. The feast of the Passover sees a large number of pilgrims coming from all over the diaspora meaning the scattered crowd of the Jews. And that is why we see a large crowd in verse 12. We see that those who came at the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. How did these non-resident pilgrims get so much interested in Jesus? The crowd that was with Jesus when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to bear witness. So let's read verse 17. Now, the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. That is why these people are interested in Jesus. Verse 18. Many people, because they had heard that he performed the signs, went out to meet him. This witness spreads to this large pilgrim crowd like a wildfire. And in response to what they heard about Jesus regarding Lazarus being raised from the dead, they do a few things as Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. 1, let's read verse 13. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. Number 1, they took palm tree branches and came to Jesus. Palm branches were a Jewish national symbol. National spirits were revived at this time. Then they cried out Hosanna, which comes from the Hebrew word Hoshienu, which means save us. The pilgrims expressed their hope in the coming Messiah to rescue them or save them from the Roman oppression. At this point, as always, the Jews, both resident and the non-resident, were expecting a political Messiah to deliver them from the Romans and give them deliverance, which had eluded them since the days of the Babylonian captivity. They thought that Jesus would use his powers shown in his signs to defeat the Romans. Like all of them know that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. So they were just thinking, oh, if he raised Lazarus from the dead, obviously he has the power to uh, defeat the Romans. Now, this is not the first time that the Jews who came to Israel during the Passover misunderstand Jesus' abilities. In chapter 6 of John, when Jesus fed the 20,000 plus people there, they attempted to make him a king. It is worth noticing that in chapter 6, Jesus withdraws away from the crowd, but here he goes along with what the crowd said and did. That's something we need to note. And then the third thing that we see in this verse is that they said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." They're crying out Psalm 118, verse 25 and 26, which is a verse of the Hallel Psalms. Hallel Psalms are the collection of Psalms 113 to 118, and they used to sing this during the Passover week. The one who comes in the name of the Lord is the King of Israel. Luke 19, verse 38. Psalm 113 to 118 was repeatedly sung by the Israelites in their anticipation of a king who would save them from the Roman tyranny. However, as we read Psalm 118, it is not just the national deliverance being referred to. The spiritual redemption of the Jews is the key element in Psalm 118, verse 19 and 20. So let me just read that out. Psalm 118, verse 19 and 20. It reads like this: "Open for me the gates of the righteous. I will enter and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord through which the righteous may enter." Salvation, righteousness, and all of those elements are involved in the deliverance that God will give to Israel. Now, in verse 14, let's come back to John 12 and verse 14. Let me read that. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. Jesus reinforces their idea of him being king in verse 14, where he finds a young donkey and deliberately sits on it. There are a few things we need to understand about Jesus choosing to sit on a donkey. One, donkeys were not considered useless in biblical times. Today, we use the word donkey as a cuss word. I mean, not we, people around the world use donkeys as a cuss word to mean foolish, good for nothing, and all that. But that is not how it was in the biblical times. In fact, it was associated with kingship. Kings of Israel were introduced to the people by riding on a donkey or a mule. Let me take you to 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 33. 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 33. It reads like this. Just give me a moment. Yeah. So it reads like this. And he said to them, "Take your Lord's servants with you, and have Solomon my son mount my own mule and take him down to Gihon." 1 Kings 1 verse 33 tells us of how David communicated to Israel that Solomon, not Adonijah, was the true king of Israel. With Jesus replicating Solomon riding on a donkey or a mule, Jesus gave intentional reminders that he is the son of David who is bringing the kingdom of his father David. Mark 11 and verse 10. And then the next thing, Jesus found a young donkey and sits on it to fulfill Zechariah 9 verse 9. And that's the verse recorded in John 12 verse 15. "Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt." See, uh, John brings in the phrase "fear not" from Isaiah 40 verse 9 and clubs that with Zechariah 9 verse 9 to communicate the fact that sinners who are afraid of the righteousness of God who demands a sinner's punishment need not worry. I'll repeat that. Fear not. Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. In that fear not, the communication that John seeks to throw out is this: sinners who are afraid of the righteousness of God, who demands a sinner's punishment, need not worry. The daughter of Zion is a poetic way of referring to Jerusalem, and they are told not to fear because their king is coming, seated on a donkey, appointed to be enthroned. Jesus sitting on a donkey makes the people erupt with joy, as there has been no Davidic king in power over the last 600 plus years since Zedekiah. The coming of Jesus on the donkey gives them hope of a deliverance from the Roman occupation. The disciples too thought about Jesus as the political Messiah, as seen in the statement by the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Luke chapter 24 and verse 21 is the passage that I just referred to. I'll just make you read that. Luke's Gospel, chapter 24 and verse 21. It reads like this. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. As they thought and heard about the title king of Israel, they thought Jesus was a political Messiah. After Jesus' glorification, they will see the reality of Jesus' deity and his mission to suffer and die as they see the title of king through the lens of Zephaniah 3 verse 15 and Zechariah 9 verse 9. Again, the Pharisees come into the picture. And they appear to lose control over what is happening in front of them. In chapter 11, they showed unbelief even after knowing that Jesus raised the dead. In 12 verse 10, they plotted to kill Jesus and Lazarus and thus remove the evidence pointing to Jesus' claims. Just when they began planning to kill Lazarus, they forgot to take into account the crowd which had seen Lazarus' resurrection. They forgot to kill them as well, in other words. They continued. The crowd that witnessed Lazarus' resurrection continued to bear witness to the larger crowd to the extent that the Pharisees couldn't do anything about the growing popularity of Jesus. Jesus even hinted at it in Luke 19 verse 40, where if these disciples kept quiet, the very stones around them would cry out in adoration. The Pharisees remarked to each other that they gain nothing. Verse 19. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone behind him. All their plans to cut off Jesus' popularity backfires. Then they make an overstatement. The world has gone after him. In some ways it is true because the diaspora Jews and the proselytes from all over the then known world came to Israel. And now I'll take you to some lessons which we will go through as part of this text. Number one, we, the readers, must not forget that Jesus' identity as Messiah and King of Israel and the world is intrinsically tied to his death and resurrection that facilitates the salvation of mankind. For example, some people think about Jesus as the Messiah, but they deny his death and resurrection, namely the Muslims. The Quran is affirming that Jesus is the Messiah, but they vehemently deny the fact that Jesus died and rose again. But we must understand here that if Jesus is Messiah, it is also equally necessary to accept the fact that he died and rose again. See, only in that background is his kingship supposed to be seen. He isn't just concerned about being the king of the Jews, even though that is just one aspect of his person. Jesus, who is the eternal Son of God, came to usher God's kingdom into the earth by giving man who was born in sin an opportunity to be restored with God in a relationship where he is our king. And for him to be our king, our problem of sin and death must be dealt with in God's righteousness. God does it through his Son, who would fulfill every demand in accordance with God's righteousness by a perfect life, death, and resurrection. And through this, he becomes the king of our life. So let me give out an application question here. Do you have Jesus as your king? Are you a recipient of the salvation that he brings to you in righteousness? Have you come to God on the merits of Jesus' perfect life, death, and resurrection? Number two, if your view of Jesus is not fully accurate, you will eventually abandon him because he didn't meet your expectations at all or in the time being. As we look at this crowd that gave him a grand welcome with such loud shouts, praising his lineage, this will be the same crowd 1 week later that demands Jesus' death by crucifixion. You know why this happens? Because he didn't appear at the first time as a warrior who would overthrow the Romans. Sure, in the future, he would restore the kingdom of Israel to Israel, and that wasn't the purpose of his coming at the first time. Jesus came in his first coming as the Messiah who would suffer and die, as it is written about him in the scriptures, and then enter his glory. Luke 24, verse 26. He would suffer and die to save his people from their sins. Matthew 1, verse 21. Once he entered into glory after completing the will of the Father, he will restore the kingdom to Israel at a time that the Father has fixed. Acts 1, verse 6 and 7. They thought that Jesus' death would be the stumbling block to the restoration of the kingdom and therefore rejected him. The reality is that the death of Jesus and the subsequent resurrection were the key to the restoration of Israel. As a result, some of the crowd abandons Jesus. Similar to this, we find lots of people coming to Jesus with the hope that he would restore world peace, remove sickness, sorrow, and pain, and death, and other things like war and oppression and unrest. It's true that Jesus will remove all of these things in the end. Some want Jesus to do it now. They go back away from Christ because they don't see the world improving. Dear listener, Jesus the King, the Messiah, will bring order and restoration into this world which is affected by the fall. The key to it is the removal of the root problem of sin, which happened at the cross. And that happened at the cross. Don't have the wrong impression about Jesus or reject him because nothing is happening right now. Nothing of what he can do is happening right now. Don't do that. It will come to pass at the time that he sees fit at the behest of the Father. The proof of all what Revelation 21 describes is the defeat of sin, Satan, and death on the cross where Jesus died. Number three, realize that whatever man plans to thwart God's will to glorify Jesus will fail miserably. The more efforts the Pharisees and the chief priests took to suppress the movement of Christ, the stronger it became. We see this in today's world. A lot of places in the world are now hostile to the message of the gospel. What God does is that he moves people from those places to other places in the world where there is freedom for them to listen to God's word. If person-to-person interactions are impossible, God makes sure that his work is done online. No one and nothing can stop the good news from spreading in the world. Therefore, as an application, remember this, be bold to continue looking for opportunities around you to spread the message of the kingdom because we have the omnipotent sovereign God on our side. His purposes never fail. Alright, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke conclude the triumphal entry with the temple cleansing that happens a week before Jesus dies. However, his interactions with the people who came for the Passover feast doesn't end here. We will see more about it in the subsequent verses. How will the people respond to Jesus' words? How long will their euphoria continue? And these are the questions which will be addressed in the next few verses, precisely chapter 12, verse 20 to 26. And that will be dealt with, hopefully, in the next week or so. All right. Thanks for listening patiently. May God speak with you.